Have you ever been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Have the consequences ever been so dire that it cost you your life? Imagine yourself dying slowly in excruciating pain, slowly suffocating, unable to move or cry out because you're paralyzed. Now imagine that it is your own leaders, the United States government, allowing and even implementing this form of death and torture. That is what the death penalty is. Since 1976, the United States has put to death 1,233 of its own citizens. And currently, there are over 3,200 prisoners on death row. There are several reasons that capital punishment is wrong and needs to be abolished. It is bad for our country. It is unfair to our citizens. It is not a deterrent, and it is cruel and unusual punishment. First, using the death penalty is bad for our country. At the very least, it is terrible for our reputation and international relations. We are among the few remaining developed countries that still use the death penalty, and we are in very bad company with other countries that do use it. In 2009, the United States killed 52 death row inmates. That's a great number that is only outranked by Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and China. Another problem is the financial cost. Proponents of the death penalty often say it would cost us much less just to kill a prisoner than to house the prisoner for the rest of their lives. But this is not the case. It is estimated that for a prisoner to spend life in prison without parole, it would cost about $500,000. On the other hand, it costs approximately $2 million per prisoner sentenced to death. Now, these extra costs are attributed to free legal counsel that is required in all capital punishment trials, the appeals process, and the maintenance of a separate wing in prisons. One of the most concerning problems with us using the death penalty is that the United Nations has called for a moratorium on all government-sanctioned executions. As a member of the UN, we are in violation of their expectations and therefore in poor standing with not only the UN as a whole, but all of the nations that are members. Not only is the death penalty bad for the whole country, but it is unfair to its citizens, even those we consider to be the least of us. There are some astounding discrepancies in how the death penalty is carried out among different races, genders, people with mental illness, and people with different economic status. The Mental Health America organization estimates that 5 to 10% of death row inmates suffer from a severe psychiatric disorder. Now, this is likely a low estimate, as anyone who does not value human life and is able to take another human's life is likely suffering from a mental illness that has never been diagnosed. This was even a stance taken by the Supreme Court as early as the 1840s, saying crime indicates diseased mind in the same manner that sickness and pain do a diseased body. Now, the court is supposed to take into consideration the mental health of a defendant in capital punishment trials, but unfortunately, juries often reject the insanity plea even when there is overwhelming evidence that the defendant is mentally ill. There are also considerations for the great inequality between gender and races. Since 1976, 99.1% of all executed prisoners were male, and African Americans make up 12% of the general U.S. population, but a staggering 40% of death row inmates. The economically disadvantaged are also much more likely to be put to death. The American Bar Association has declared guidelines for the minimum standards of legal representation required by a defendant during a capital punishment trial. At this time, there is not a single state in the nation that provides enough funds to meet even these minimum standards. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said, people who are well represented at trial do not receive the death penalty. Now, the consequences for not being well represented at trial are quite dire, and they can be seen in the case of Judy Haney from Alabama. Her lawyer showed up drunk to her capital punishment trial. Now, the lawyer was reprimanded and held in contempt of court and sent to spend the night in jail. But once he sobered up, he came and represented her the next day at her same capital punishment trial, and Judy Haney is still on death row to this day. Since 1976, there have been 82 prisoners released from death row based on new evidence pointing towards their evidence. Now, they were likely imprisoned due to poor representation. 82 people were released, and this amounts to 1 in 7 death row inmates being sentenced to death, even though they're innocent. Now, there was a Senate report that says this isn't really a problem. They said, all that can be expected of human authorities is that they take every reasonable precaution against the danger of error. If errors are made, this is the necessary price that must be paid within a society which is made up of human beings. Is that a stance you're okay with your government having? Seemingly, the most used argument for the death penalty is that it'll make our nation safer. But this is simply not the case. It is not a crime deterrent. The crime rate has not gone down since the re-implementation of the death penalty in 1976. In fact, Texas and Oklahoma have the highest execution rates, and they also have a higher than the national average murder rate. And that rate increased in 2003. The United States also has a significantly higher crime rate than Britain and Australia, which are two countries that do not use the death penalty. And there are recent changes in life without prison, where life without parole. And this actually means that the prisoner will serve a life sentence and not be paroled. And therefore, the society is just as safe from that criminal as if that criminal were to be put to death. And if death is not effective in protecting our society, then isn't the only reason for implementing it revenge? It can also be argued that the death penalty is unconstitutional because it is considered cruel and unusual punishment. The Eighth Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1787, and it clearly bans the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment. In 1972, Justice Brennan set out 4 principles to determine if something is cruel and unusual punishment. The first principle is that it cannot be a severe punishment that takes away from human dignity. I question how you can maintain human dignity when the average prisoner will spend 11 years awaiting his sentence of execution, which will likely take place in front of an audience. The second principle of cruel and unusual punishment is that it must not be handed out arbitrarily. Now, we've already seen how arbitrarily the death penalty can be handed down, considering race and economic status. The third standard is that it must not be wholly and completely rejected throughout society. Now, our society has accepted public executions using burning at the stake, firing squad, hanging, and the electric chair. All of these things were accepted in our society at one point, and all of these things have been deemed cruel and unusual punishment now. So it is plausible to believe that lethal injection will eventually be deemed cruel and unusual punishment once our society learns just how horrible it is. The lethal injection was originally made to be administered by medical professionals. Unfortunately, killing a patient is completely counter to the oaths that all medical professionals are required to take. Therefore, most doctors refuse to administer lethal injection at this time. And now that the professionals are not the one administering it, there are many more mistakes. Mistakes that lead to excruciatingly painful deaths that can last up to 20 minutes. In fact, some of these chemicals that are used in lethal injection are actually banned in several states in the United States to be used in the humane euthanization of animals. Now, the fourth principle in determining whether the punishment is cruel and unusual is if it is a severe punishment that is patently unnecessary. In other words, is it disproportionate to the crime? Now, I'm sure we're all aware that murderers can be put to death. But did you know that that is not the only crime punishable by death in this country? Kidnapping, treason, espionage, sex assault, drug trafficking, and hijacking a plane are all crimes punishable by death in this country. And altogether, there are 60 crimes that are punishable by death, even if the offender did not take another's life. Now, considering all of this information, considering that it is bad for our country, unfair to our citizens, that it is not a deterrent, and that it is cruel and unusual punishment, it is clear that the death penalty is wrong and needs to be abolished. After all, as Helen Prejean once said, and she is the inspiration for the movie Dead Man Walking, government can't be trusted to control its own bureaucrats or collect taxes equitably or fill a pothole, much less decide which of its citizens to kill.